Are Democrats going to retake Congress? Well, given the special elections that just happened February 13th, it might look like they are. And given the current Democratic led bill in the Senate to increase funding to Ukraine and Israel, things are about to get very tricky, especially coming up to 2024. So what I want to do with today's video is give you an analysis of what those special elections mean, because the number one thing you're going to see is that certain special elections are an indicator of what is going to happen in November of 2024 around the Trump-Biden election. Now, there's a lot of different intricacies and layers to each one of these special elections, and so we're going to break some of them down. The first one that we're going to talk about is the most famous one, the New York 3rd District special election. What was the background of this special election? This is actually a very interesting congressional seat. And as we all know, Republicans have a very narrow margin in Congress. So every seat that they lose is a very big deal, especially as it runs up to 2024. It means it's going to be easier for Democrats to flip the House if they can continue to win even small special elections. This special election was triggered by George Santos, the famous guy who said all kinds of outrageous things, was accused of fraud in Congress. But nevertheless, the one unique thing about George Santos was he won the district. The district used to be primarily Democratic. If you look at the district's history of New York District 3, it goes back a ways of being majority Republican, then switching to majority Democrat. And then George Santos actually flipped that. So as crazy as he might seem, to his credit, he was able to campaign effectively enough to turn that district from a blue district to a solid red district. If you look at the numbers, look at the margins in which he won, I believe it was over 6 to maybe even 10%. That's pretty damn good. Now, of course, this was a huge debate because as George Santos was going through the process of being forced to resign, a lot of Republicans said that they did not want him to, regardless of the potential corruption that he was going to be guilty of. There was a few legal hurdles actually around that. One was setting the precedent that if a congressman is simply accused of something, even if they're not found guilty, should they be forced to resign? Well, apparently that answer is yes now, which is a whole box of worms for a lot of people in Congress. But the other factor was a lot of people didn't want him to leave strategically because they knew he could hold on to the congressional seat. George Santos was well liked within the community, and the margins showed that. Even though this was his first time winning, still he had a very comfortable lean. It also helps that the district in which George Santos won was, even though it's a majority white district, had a heavily Hispanic population. So George Santos was able to appeal to a large, diverse crowd. It also has a very large Asian population, by the way, I believe mostly Chinese. He was able to get a large appeal from not just those Republican white voters, but from a lot of Hispanic and Asian voters as well, and the data showed that. The amount of votes that he got in total were enormous. Now, here we go. He resigns, and now there's a special election between the former Democratic congressional candidate who was in the seat that George Santos originally overthrew, and another Republican candidate who apparently did not do so well. Here's an interesting difference. George Santos was very pro-Trump, very outspokenly pro-Trump. He was also pro-gay. He was kind of this interesting character within the Republican Party. Some could even say the future of the Republican Party, where they're even more left-leaning on social issues, but still have a very conservative bent on certain other topics, especially like immigration, which is now a winning Republican issue, at least if you're on Long Island, as previous special elections have shown. So George Santos was a very interesting figure, regardless of his corruption. But the Republican that was running to replace him was not Hispanic and was apparently not as well liked or as well known as some other potential candidates. So the key of this special election was turnout, number one, was very low. Turnout was incredibly low. It looked like there were under 10 to 15,000 votes. That is nothing in compared to George Santos, who I believe won by a margin of 155,000 votes. That's a huge difference. Now, maybe the weather had something to do with this, or maybe just people weren't excited at all. The funny thing about this special election is they're now going to have to face off in the general election, which hopefully Republicans would be smart enough to understand maybe we need another person like George Santos, just without some of the side corruption that appeared to come from him. That's if Republicans want to keep Congress, at least the House. What that means as far as the larger picture is you need to remember this. If the Senate goes Republican, which it's looking likely to do, and the House votes and goes Democratic, there will actually be quite a bit of agreement between those two chambers as long as Mitch McConnell is head of the Senate. And I guess it would depend on who would be the new head of the House on the Democratic side, assuming it's the current minority leader. But for example, the Ukraine bill that passed the Senate and is not even going to be heard in the Republican House probably would pass in a Democratic House. Now, we already know that there's a bunch of Republicans who would vote for this Ukraine bill, and all Democrats voted for this Ukraine bill. So you could almost say that a Senate, a Senate that's Republican run and a House that is Democratic run would be perfect for what we would call, or what some people might call, the uniparty agenda, or maybe even just the pro-war agenda if you're for war in Ukraine, and if you're for giving more weapons to Israel, if you're for maybe more weapons to Taiwan and other parts of the global arena. So every election counts, and this special election specifically is an interesting reader marker because, in my opinion, it actually shows that Trump is very well liked in this district just by the fact that the margin that George Santos won on was incredibly huge. So people saying that this is a mandate against Trump and that actually Trump, this makes him look bad and makes Republicans look bad, is psyoping you. It's actually not correct at all. If anything, the recent election shows that if a Republican wants to win in New York's District 13, District 3, then they need to, one, embrace Trump, and they need to embrace the platforms of the former Congressman George Santos. Now, we kind of switched gears because there was another special election that, even on a minor scale, was just equally as important. And it's so important that even President Biden commented on that. And that was a district in Pennsylvania to see if the Republicans or the Democrats were going to have a majority in the House. Now, there's multiple layers to this story, especially because the Democrats have had control of the House in Pennsylvania with a very, very slim majority, very slim majority. And so this race was over House District 140. And what's interesting about House District 140 is it has been redistricted, right? And traditionally it has been Democratic, at least on the state level. So the redistricting, I'm not entirely sure how that would have shaped things, but one thing that I can tell you is it shouldn't be too surprising that the Democrat won in this district, and there shouldn't be too much of a big deal to people who see it go Democrat when previously it had always been a Democratic-leaning district. The turnout was incredibly low. They were under 10,000 votes just for this special election. So it will give Democrats control of the Pennsylvania House. The Senate in Pennsylvania is still controlled by Republicans, meaning that there is no uniparty in Pennsylvania, which still means that, you know, especially when it comes to elections, when, you know, the power of the states and whoever's control of the state really matters, it really kind of, to me, leads up to the fact that Pennsylvania could still be in the taking if you are a Republican like Trump. So this special election, even though people are also trying to read into some of the bigger issues, it's redistricting, plus the fact that it was already mostly Democratic and has a history being Democratic, doesn't tell me that it's actually much of a bellwether at all. If anything, you could say it's more business as usual, and that there are probably more competitive districts to run around. So the common theme and issue for both the New York election and the Pennsylvania election is that Democrats put abortion on the front lines for their campaign. Now, the idea is that abortion should be the number one issue that Democrats run on this next election cycle, and some of them are already putting that strategy into works. I'm not entirely sure, though, if these two examples really give a clear picture of whether that strategy is effective, because in Pennsylvania, you take a redistricted area that is still mostly Democrat and has been Democrat. When a Democrat wins that, I'm not sure that proves that the messaging was any better, especially when the Democratic wins by a pretty comfortable margin. But once again, what's interesting is this Pennsylvania special election had lower turnout than when the previous guy would run by himself without competition. So this special election only had about 10,000 people turn out, when the previous purely Democratic House member had about 17,000 people turn out. So maybe this will be a little bit different come 2024 November, and this could be another district to watch. But the biggest key factor is here is turnout is really low. And that is certainly still true for New York and New York's district and special election. So you can't really read too much into these. Of course, both sides are going to be talking about propaganda and using it to their advantage or disadvantage. Trump went on Truth Social to roast the Republican candidate who was trying to compete in the New York District 3 special election, most likely to keep her from running again in November, hopefully giving the field, which now there's a lot of people who have entered both the Democratic and Republican primary for this congressional district, some new blood, and hopefully pick a different party favorite. The most interesting fact is the Republican machine, from what I've read and heard, is actually incredibly strong in New York District 3. They control a lot of local offices and have really gotten a very good ground game, which is a theme that I think we're seeing throughout the 2024 election. I'm seeing multiple reports about how Trump's ground game is actually 10 times better than it was in 2016 and 2020, no doubt due to his campaign staff and his seasoned campaign team. But that is a big factor because people underestimate how important ground game is, even in these special elections. So what do you need to keep an eye out for? What do you really need to know? The number one thing you need to know that anytime there's a special election, everything is in a bubble. And these special elections are kind of microcosms for what might happen in the broader United States, but not always. And so when you do the math, you do the numbers, and you look at the background of each special election, whether it goes Republican or Democrat, you often find that the story is much more nuanced. But you have to remember that the majority of people don't look at those things. And so what some people's goal is, say you're a Democrat and you win the New York District 3 election like the Democrat did, now they're going to say this is momentum and that Democrats are poised to retake the House and try to give other candidates momentum by saying this is effective, Trump's a loser, Trump is not going to win, and this is what we can do. Even though that might be the wrong message because the particular circumstance in which a Democrat might have won in a special election won't apply nationally. And it also doesn't factor in that maybe the Republican candidate was actually terrible and followed a different strategy than the previous guy, George Santos, who won by huge margins. So I actually am not entirely sure that this congressional district will stay Democratic. No doubt in my mind tells me actually that if someone like another George Santos type figure comes along, is very pro-Trump and sticks close to Trump in that area and espouses the same message that George Santos did, I think they'll do quite well and that Republicans could retake this seat in a matter of just 6 months. But that is yet to be seen. The number one thing you need to understand is anytime the media is trying to take a small microcosm and expand it, certainly there are facets of life in which that can be true, but it's not always. So it's your job, the reader, and my job, the reporter to you, the reader, to always dive a little bit deeper and really see what's going on.